There are certain kinds of sadness that don't announce themselves loudly. They don't slam doors or throw things or collapse dramatically in the middle of busy rooms. They settle in quietly, the way fog settles over a valley at dawn, and before you realize what has happened, everything familiar has disappeared inside it. That was the kind of sadness that lived inside Caleb Harmon. Quiet, dense, and heartbreakingly patient. He was 3 years old, and he had already learned that the world could take something from you without any warning whatsoever. Caleb's mother, Danielle Harmon, was the kind of person who made every room feel warmer just by walking into it. At 26, she was young and vibrant and wonderfully, stubbornly alive. A night shift pediatric nurse who spent her days off building blanket forts in the living room, inventing ridiculous songs about vegetables to get Caleb to eat his dinner, and slow dancing with her son in the kitchen to songs that had nothing to do with children but everything to do with joy. She called Caleb her whole entire universe. Not just her world, her universe. Because the world, she always said, was too small a thing to contain what she felt for him. She had dreams. She was saving money to go back to school for her nursing practitioner license. She had a vision board on her bedroom wall covered in magazine cutouts of beach houses and graduation caps and pictures of Caleb at various ages. Surrounded by sticky notes filled with handwritten goals she fully intended to achieve. She was the kind of woman who made plans and then actually followed through on them, which made what happened on that October Wednesday night feel not just tragic but cosmically wrong. Like the universe had made a catastrophic clerical error that nobody had the authority to fix. It was an ordinary night. Caleb had his bath, drank his warm milk, and listened to Danielle read him 2 chapters of a picture book about a bear who couldn't find his hat. She tucked the blanket around him with that particular tucking-in thoroughness that only mothers possess, kissed his forehead 3 times, always 3, never 2, never 4, and whispered, "I love you to the edge of everything, baby." Caleb was asleep before she finished closing his bedroom door. He never heard what happened next. The neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Elkins, a 70-year-old woman who lived in the apartment directly below and had a habit of keeping her television too loud, heard the fall at 11:47 p.m. She waited a few minutes, convinced she had imagined it. Then she heard nothing, which somehow felt worse than a sound. She called 911 at 11:52. The paramedics arrived in under 6 minutes. It wasn't enough time. Danielle Harmon had suffered a massive cardiac event, a condition she hadn't known she carried, silent and waiting in her young heart like a ticking clock with no face. She was gone before the ambulance doors opened. Caleb slept through all of it. He woke up the next morning with the particular bright-eyed energy of a well-rested 3-year-old, who had absolutely no idea that the entire architecture of his life had collapsed overnight. He climbed out of bed, dragged his stuffed rabbit by one ear down the hallway, and went to find his mama. He called her name in the kitchen. He called it in the living room. He stood outside her bedroom door, which was open, the bed empty and neatly made by hands that were not Danielle's, and called it again, in a voice that was slowly shifting from confident to uncertain. "Mama." Linda Harmon, who had arrived at 2 a.m., and spent the remaining hours of the night doing the impossible work of holding herself together, came around the corner and found her grandson standing in that hallway with his stuffed rabbit under his arm and his head tilted at an angle that shattered her completely. She knelt down in front of him right there on the hallway floor and gathered him into her arms without saying a word, because there were no words yet. There would need to be words eventually. Careful and gentle words chosen with the precision of a surgeon, but not yet, not at 7 a.m. with the morning light just beginning to come through the windows and everything still so raw and impossible. Caleb let her hold him. He didn't fully understand, but children understand more than we think they do, and somewhere beneath the confusion, beneath the not yet formed comprehension of permanent loss, Caleb Harmon felt the shape of what had happened. He felt it in the way Linda was holding him, too tight, too long, with a desperation that didn't belong to ordinary hugs. He felt it in the silence of the apartment, which had a new quality to it, an absence with texture and weight. He felt it the way animals feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. He didn't say anything. He just held on. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Linda's life, and she had lived through hard things before. She watched her grandson move through the stages of early grief in ways that no parenting book had ever prepared her for. He stopped asking where his mama was after the second week, not because he had forgotten, but because somewhere in his small, perceptive heart, he had absorbed the fact that the question had no answer that would make him feel better. His toy trucks lined up untouched along the bedroom windowsill. The blanket fort materials, 2 dining chairs, and a collection of mismatched bedsheets sat in the corner of the living room exactly where Danielle had left them during their last fort-building session, because neither Linda nor Caleb could bring themselves to put them away. The picture book about the bear who couldn't find his hat stayed on the nightstand with a bookmark still in it, holding the place where Danielle had stopped reading. Caleb stopped talking the way he used to. He had been such a verbal child, a non-stop, enthusiastic, glorious chatterbox who had opinions about everything from the unfairness of bedtime to the correct pronunciation of spaghetti. That child had gone somewhere quiet and deep, and the child who remained in his place was watchful and still and heartbreakingly well-behaved in the way that grieving children sometimes are, as if they are trying very hard not to cause any additional trouble in a world that already seems to have too much of it. Linda took him to a child therapist named Dr. Renee Alcott, a warm-voiced woman with an office full of soft toys and a gift for meeting children exactly where they were. Dr. Alcott told Linda that Caleb was processing, that grief in young children was non-linear and often expressed through behavior changes rather than words, that patience and consistency and physical closeness were the most powerful tools available. Linda did all of it. She was patient and consistent and physically close every single day. She read to him every night, even when he stared at the ceiling instead of the pictures. She made his favorite foods. She kept his routines sacred and predictable. She talked about Danielle gently and openly, keeping her daughter's memory present in their daily life. "Your mama loved this song," she would say, or "Your mama used to make her eggs exactly this way." It helped, slowly, incrementally it helped. But the smile didn't come back. That particular smile, wide and unguarded, and full of the specific joy that had belonged to Caleb before October, remained absent, like a light that had blown a fuse somewhere deep in the wall where nobody could quite reach it. Linda missed it with a physical ache. She didn't know, on that Tuesday morning when she packed his crackers and his juice box and his stuffed rabbit, and loaded him into the car for a courthouse errand, he was too young to understand that today was going to be the day everything changed. She didn't know that across town, a Belgian Malinois named Rex was already on duty. She didn't know that some things in this world cannot be planned or scheduled or achieved through patience alone, that some healings require an unexpected catalyst, a moment that arrives sideways from a direction nobody was watching. She didn't know any of that. She just held Caleb's hand as they walked through the courthouse doors, and she whispered another quiet prayer that they would get through the morning in one piece. The marble floors were cold beneath their feet. Rex was already watching the door. There are things that dogs know that humans will never fully understand. Not because humans aren't intelligent enough to understand them, but because humans lost access to that particular frequency of knowing somewhere along the way, buried it under language and logic and the comfortable noise of civilization, and forgot it was ever there to begin with. Dogs never lost it. Dogs carry it with them everywhere they go, that ancient, unfiltered ability to feel the emotional temperature of a room the way a human feels physical heat, immediately, completely, and without any need for explanation. Rex carried it more than most. He had been born in a breeding facility in the Netherlands, a country with a long, distinguished history of producing working dogs of extraordinary quality. His lineage was impeccable, traced back through 4 generations of Belgian Malinois who had served in police departments, military units, and search and rescue operations across 3 continents. From the very first weeks of his life, the trainers who evaluated him had noted something in his assessments that didn't appear often, something they circled and underlined, and discussed among themselves in the careful, measured language of professionals who didn't want to sound like they were exaggerating. He was, in the words of his lead trainer, emotionally exceptional. Not just intelligent, Malinois were always intelligent. It was practically written into their DNA. Not just obedient, obedience was the baseline, the floor, the minimum acceptable standard for a working dog of his caliber. What Rex had was something rarer and harder to quantify. He had the ability to distinguish between types of human distress the way a musician distinguishes between notes, precisely, instinctively, and with an accuracy that consistently surprised even the people who worked with him daily. He could tell the difference between a person who was frightened and a person who was dangerous. He could tell the difference between someone in physical pain and someone in emotional pain. He had, on 2 separate occasions during his training, abandoned a scheduled drill entirely to go sit beside a handler who was having a panic attack, before the handler had shown any outward signs of distress whatsoever. When asked to explain it, the trainers simply shrugged and said Rex felt things coming before they arrived. Officer Marcus Dunley had learned this about his partner within the first month of their working relationship, and he had spent the subsequent 3 years making peace with the fact that his dog was, in certain profound and inexplicable ways, wiser than he was. That Tuesday morning had begun like every other courthouse assignment, routine, controlled, and deliberately uneventful. Rex had been through the security checkpoint sweep at 7:45 a.m., completing his rounds with the focused efficiency that made him one of the most requested K-9 units for courthouse duty in the Charlotte Division. He checked the lobby, the stairwells, the areas near the courtrooms where large gatherings of people created the kind of unpredictable energy that required monitoring. Everything was clear, everything was normal. Rex returned to his post beside Officer Dunley at the main security checkpoint and sat alert, professional, still, while the courthouse filled with its usual Tuesday morning population of lawyers, defendants, witnesses, clerks, and the miscellaneous collection of ordinary people who found themselves tangled up in the machinery of the legal system for reasons ranging from the mundane to the devastating. Dunley sipped his coffee. Rex watched the room. For approximately 53 minutes, nothing happened that was outside the parameters of a normal courthouse morning. And then Rex smelled something that stopped him cold. It wasn't a dangerous smell. It carried no chemical signature of threat, no biological markers of aggression, no sensory information that translated to any of the alert categories Rex had been trained to respond to. It was something else entirely, something that his training hadn't given him a name for but his nature understood completely. It was the smell of grief. Human grief has a physiological reality that most people don't know about. When a person has been living inside profound sadness for an extended period of time, their body chemistry changes in ways that are subtle but measurable. Elevated cortisol levels alter skin chemistry. Disrupted sleep patterns change the composition of breath. The suppression of normal emotional expression creates a kind of biometric signature that sensitive instruments can sometimes detect. Rex was a more sensitive instrument than anything built in a laboratory. He had caught the scent from across the room, faint, diffused through the recycled courthouse air, mixed in with coffee and cleaning solution and the accumulated human presence of hundreds of people, but unmistakable to him. It was the particular heartbreaking scent of a grief that had been going on for a long time. Not fresh grief, not the acute sharp smell of immediate shock and loss, but something older and more settled. something that had moved in and unpacked its bags. And it was coming from something very small. Rex stood up. The movement was so sudden and uncharacteristic that Dunley actually startled, sloshing coffee over the edge of his cup, and making a sound that he would later describe, with some embarrassment, as a yelp. "Rex, heel," he said, using his firmest command voice, the one that had never once failed to work in 3 years of partnership. Rex did not heel. He stood with all 4 paws planted, his body oriented toward the far corner of the waiting area with the kind of absolute physical certainty that Dunley had only ever seen him display when tracking a specific scent trail. But his body language was entirely wrong for a threat alert. There was no tension in his hindquarters, no raised hackles running along his spine, no low warning vibration in his chest. His tail moved in a single slow, deliberate arc. His ears were forward and soft rather than pinned and sharp. He was not alerting. He was reaching. Dunley followed his partner's gaze across the crowded lobby, letting his eyes travel past the lawyers and the clerks and the uniformed officers and the ordinary Tuesday morning people, until they landed on a small wooden bench in the far corner of the waiting area where a tiny boy sat beside an older woman, completely still, pressing a stuffed rabbit against his chest like it was the only solid thing left in his world. Something happened in Dunley's chest that he didn't have an immediate name for. He looked back down at Rex. Rex looked back up at him with those amber eyes, steady, certain, communicating something that bypassed language entirely and landed somewhere in the older, quieter part of Dunley's brain where instinct lived. "This matters," those eyes said. "This one matters right now." Dunley had a decision to make, and he made it in about 4 seconds. He had rules. He had protocols. He had a post to maintain and a responsibility to the security of an active federal courthouse. Rex was not a therapy dog. Rex was not cleared for civilian emotional support interactions. There was no regulation, no procedural guideline, no training manual chapter that covered what was currently happening. But there was also 12 years of experience telling him that sometimes the most important thing you can do is get out of the way and let something extraordinary happen without interference. He loosened his grip on the leash. Just slightly, just enough. Rex moved forward immediately, not rushing, not pulling with the urgency of a dog chasing something, but walking with the measured, deliberate grace of an animal that knows exactly where it needs to be and understands that getting there carefully matters as much as getting there at all. He moved through the crowd like water finding a path, steady and inevitable, his eyes never leaving the small boy in the corner. People stepped aside without knowing why. A lawyer glanced down and moved his briefcase. A clerk shifted her stack of files. The crowd parted in small, unconscious ways, as if something in Rex's manner communicated that this was not a moment to interrupt. Dunley walked behind his partner, watching everything with wide eyes and a heart that was beating slightly faster than usual, and thought to himself that in 30 years of life and 12 years of police work, he was quite possibly about to witness something he would spend the rest of his days trying to find adequate words for. Rex arrived at the bench. He sat down in front of the little boy with the stuffed rabbit. And the little boy, who hadn't smiled in 3 months, who had gone quiet as a closed room, who was carrying a weight that no 3-year-old should ever have to carry, slowly raised his eyes from the floor and looked directly into Rex's amber gaze. The courthouse kept moving around them. Phones rang, heels clicked on marble, arguments were whispered in corners, and documents were shuffled behind glass windows. But in that one small corner of that large, indifferent building, the whole world had quietly come to a stop. And Rex, who had felt something nobody else did from 50 feet away, had arrived exactly where he always intended to go. He had never been more certain of anything in his entire life. There are moments in life that arrive without any announcement whatsoever. No drumroll, no warning, No polite notification that something is about to happen that will permanently rearrange the furniture of your heart and leave you standing in the middle of your own life wondering how everything looked so ordinary just 60 seconds ago. These moments simply appear, sudden and complete and utterly transforming, and the only thing you can do when they arrive is surrender to them entirely and trust that you will find your footing on the other side. Linda Harmon had no idea she was standing at the edge of one of those moments. She was looking down at her paperwork folder, trying to organize the legal documents she needed for the clerk's window, mentally rehearsing the conversation she would need to have about her daughter's estate, when she became aware of a sound that didn't belong to the normal soundtrack of a courthouse morning. It was the sound of dog nails on marble. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. Her head came up immediately, because that is what grandmothers do, especially grandmothers who are currently the sole protectors of a grieving 3-year-old in an unfamiliar public building filled with strangers. Every protective instinct Linda Harmon possessed fired simultaneously, and she shifted her body instinctively closer to Caleb, her folder of documents forgotten, her full attention snapping to the large animal and the uniformed officer now moving in their direction through the courthouse crowd. Her first reaction was concern. Rex was not a small dog. He was 72 pounds of muscle and training and Belgian Malinois intensity, with a broad chest and a jaw that looked like it meant business and eyes that were currently fixed on her grandson, with an attention that Linda wasn't sure how to read yet. She had nothing against dogs. She had grown up with a beagle named Biscuit who had slept at the foot of her bed for 14 years. But this was a police dog, a working animal in an official capacity, and Caleb was already fragile in ways that most people couldn't see just by looking at him. The last thing she needed was for something to frighten him in a public place and unravel the careful, painstaking emotional scaffolding that she and Dr. Alcott had been building around him for 3 months. She opened her mouth to say something, some polite but firm version of "We're fine, thank you, please keep moving," and then she stopped. Because she looked at Rex's face. She would try to describe it later, in interviews and conversations and quiet moments with friends, and she would always end up shaking her head slightly because the words never quite captured it. The closest she ever got was this: Rex's face looked the way a person's face looks when they have spotted someone they love across a crowded room. Not excitement, something quieter and deeper than excitement. Recognition. Certainty. The particular expression of someone who has been looking for a specific thing and has just found it exactly where they always knew it would be. It was not the face of a dog about to cause a problem. It was the face of a dog about to solve one. Officer Dunley stopped at a respectful distance, far enough to give Linda space to make a decision, close enough that she could see his face clearly, read his intentions, make her own assessment of the situation. He was good at this, she would think later. He understood instinctively that the moment required him to be non-threatening, non-pressuring, completely open to whatever answer she gave. "Ma'am," he said quietly, pitching his voice low beneath the ambient noise of the courthouse so that the conversation stayed private, "I'm really sorry to interrupt your morning. I know this probably looks strange." He paused, glancing down at Rex with an expression that contained equal parts professional composure and undisguised wonder. "Rex doesn't do this. In 3 years of working together, I have never seen him do this. But he very strongly wants to say hello to your grandson, and I've learned over the years that when Rex is this certain about something, there's usually a reason." He met her eyes directly. "That said, you say the word and we walk away right now. No pressure whatsoever." Linda looked at Dunley. She looked at Rex. And then she looked at Caleb. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Caleb was already looking at Rex. Not the way he looked at most things these days, that flat, distant, going through the motions gaze that had replaced his old bright curiosity like a gray filter dropped over a vivid photograph. This was different. This was the old Caleb gaze, focused and present and lit from somewhere behind his eyes with something that Linda hadn't seen in 3 months and had been privately, desperately terrified she might never see again. He was looking at Rex the way he used to look at things that genuinely captured his imagination. The way he used to look at construction sites through car windows, or at the big fish tank in Dr. Alcott's waiting room, or at thunderstorms from the safety of the living room couch. With his whole face open and his whole self leaning slightly forward, as if the thing he was looking at was pulling him gently but irresistibly toward it. He hadn't leaned toward anything in 3 months. Linda's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Okay," she said. "Yes, please." What happened next unfolded with the slow, inevitable beauty of something that had always been going to happen, as if the universe had scheduled this meeting long before either of them arrived at the courthouse that morning, and was now simply watching its own plan come to fruition with quiet satisfaction. Rex moved forward. Not quickly. Every single step was measured and careful and deliberate, placed with a precision that spoke of complete awareness. Awareness of the smallness of the child in front of him. Awareness of the fragility of the moment. Awareness that speed and enthusiasm, which were perfectly appropriate in 100 other contexts, would be entirely wrong here. He moved the way you move when you are carrying something irreplaceable and you cannot afford to drop it. He reached the bench. He sat down directly in front of Caleb, close enough to be present, far enough to allow the boy a choice, because Rex understood, in whatever way dogs understand the things they understand, that choice mattered here. That this child needed to feel like he was reaching toward something rather than having something pressed upon him. He waited. 2 seconds, 3, 4. And then, with the slow grace of a creature performing a sacred and deliberate act, Rex lowered his great head, that broad, noble, black-muzzled head that had tracked criminals and swept courthouses and earned commendations that sat framed on a precinct wall, and rested it, with extraordinary gentleness, directly on Caleb's tiny knee. The weight of it was warm and real and undeniable. Caleb looked down at the dog's head resting on his knee. For a long moment, 3 seconds, 4, 5, he simply looked, processing, feeling. The stuffed rabbit slipped from his fingers without him noticing, landing silently on the courthouse floor beside his small shoes, and he didn't reach for it because something more important than a stuffed rabbit had just arrived and his entire being knew it. His hand came up slowly. Linda watched it rise, that tiny hand, those small fingers, and she held her breath so completely that she forgot she was holding it. Caleb's hand trembled slightly as it moved toward Rex's fur. Not with fear, with the particular trembling of someone reaching toward something they want so badly that the wanting itself has become almost overwhelming. His fingers made contact, just the tips at first, barely brushing the surface of Rex's thick coat, and Rex remained perfectly, absolutely still, as if he had turned himself into the most stable thing in the universe, specifically so that this child would have something solid to hold on to. Caleb's fingers moved deeper into the fur. He felt the warmth first, the deep, radiating warmth of a living creature that had chosen to be exactly here, exactly now, for exactly him. Then the texture, thick and layered and real in a way that stuffed rabbits, for all their comfort, could never quite be. Then the breathing, the slow, steady rise and fall of Rex's ribs beneath his palm, rhythmic as a heartbeat, patient as a tide. Something in Caleb's face changed. It was subtle, so subtle that a stranger wouldn't have caught it. But Linda caught it immediately, because she had been watching that face with the desperate attention of someone searching for signs of life, and she saw the exact moment it happened. The tightness left his jaw. The careful blankness that grief had installed in his expression like a protective shield. That practiced, self-protective stillness that no 3-year-old should ever have had reason to develop, began, cell by cell and breath by breath, to dissolve. Dunley watched from 2 feet away, his coffee completely forgotten, and felt something move through him that he couldn't have named if someone had offered him a dictionary and all the time in the world. Rex didn't move, didn't wag, didn't make a sound. He simply stayed, warm and present and completely, unconditionally there, and let the child feel whatever he needed to feel for as long as he needed to feel it. Because Rex understood, in the wordless and perfect way that only certain extraordinary animals ever do, that this was not a moment for doing. This was a moment for being. And 72 pounds of pure understanding was more than enough. There are certain moments that don't belong to the people who witness them. They belong to something larger, something that exists beyond the boundaries of a single courthouse, a single morning, a single grieving child, and a single remarkable dog. They belong to the part of human experience that reminds us, when we have almost forgotten, that the world still contains things worth believing in. That beauty still arrives uninvited into ordinary places. That healing doesn't always come wrapped in the packaging we expected, from the direction we were watching, in the form we thought we needed. Sometimes it arrives on 4 legs. Sometimes it has amber eyes and a black muzzle and 72 pounds of unconditional presence. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, if you happen to be standing in exactly the right corner of exactly the right courthouse on exactly the right Tuesday morning, you get to watch it happen in real time, and it changes something in you that you didn't even know needed changing. The people in that courthouse were about to get very lucky. Caleb's fingers had been moving slowly through Rex's fur for almost a full minute, exploring the texture, tracing the warmth, following the slow rhythm of the dog's breathing with the focused concentration of a child who has found something that demands his complete attention. Rex hadn't moved, hadn't shifted, hadn't made a single sound. He lay with his great head resting on the boy's knee with the patience of something ancient and wise, as if he had been specifically designed for this purpose, and everything else in his decorated career had simply been preparation for this one quiet moment on a courthouse bench. Officer Dunley stood 2 feet away and watched his partner work. He had seen Rex do extraordinary things. He had watched him track a missing elderly woman through 3 miles of dense Carolina woodland in the dark, arriving at her location with a certainty that left experienced search and rescue professionals speechless. He had watched him alert to a concealed weapon from 23 feet away, preventing what could have been a catastrophic courthouse incident before it even had the chance to begin. He had watched him perform, year after year, at a level of excellence that made Dunley proud every single day he got to call this animal his partner. But he had never watched Rex do anything like this. Because this required something different from tracking ability or scent detection or physical courage. This required something that no training program in the world had ever attempted to teach, because it was not the kind of thing that could be taught. It could only be possessed. It could only be carried, quietly, naturally, as an intrinsic part of who you were, the way Rex had always carried it. The ability to simply show up for someone who needed you, completely and without reservation, and stay. It started in Caleb's shoulders. That was where Linda noticed it first, in the almost imperceptible dropping of his shoulders away from his ears, the release of a tension so habitual and deep-seated that she had stopped consciously registering it weeks ago. It was the kind of tension that a child's body builds around prolonged grief the way a tree builds rings around drought years, quietly, incrementally, invisibly, until it becomes just another part of the structure. She saw it go. Then his jaw loosened, that careful, unconscious clenching that she had noticed in photographs from the past 3 months, the slight set of his chin that made him look, heartbreakingly, like a small person bracing for impact. It released so gradually that you might have missed it if you weren't watching with the attention of someone whose entire world had narrowed to this one child's face. Then his breathing changed, slower, deeper, the shallow, careful breathing of a child who has learned to take up as little emotional space as possible gave way to something fuller and more natural, the unhurried breathing of a child who, for the first time in a very long time, felt safe enough to exhale completely. Linda gripped her paperwork folder so hard that the edges bent. She didn't notice. Rex felt all of it happening. He felt the shoulder tension release through the subtle shift in the weight resting against his head. He felt the breathing change through the altered rhythm of the small chest near him. He felt the grief, that heavy, settled, long-term grief that he had identified from across the room, begin its slow, tentative retreat, like a tide pulling back from a shore it had occupied for too long. And Rex, who understood these things in ways that bypassed every known framework of animal cognition, and entered the territory of something that science was still decades away from adequately explaining, responded to each of these changes with the same stillness. He did not get excited. He did not press the moment. He did not do anything that might startle this fragile, beautiful process back into hiding. He simply stayed, warm, present, certain. And he waited for what he already knew was coming. It began at the corners of Caleb's mouth. The smallest possible movement, so small that you would have needed to be watching with extraordinary attention to catch it at the very beginning. A slight upward twitch at the left corner first, then the right, like two tiny birds simultaneously deciding to take flight. Dunley saw it and felt his own breath stop somewhere in the middle of his chest. Then it spread upward along Caleb's cheeks, filling them out, rounding them, returning to them the particular fullness that belongs to children's faces when they are genuinely, completely happy, and have not yet learned to moderate or conceal it. The kind of fullness that photographers spend entire careers trying to capture and almost never do, because it exists only in the instant before self-consciousness arrives, in the pure unguarded space between feeling something and deciding whether to show it. Caleb was nowhere near self-consciousness. Caleb was somewhere much better than that. His eyes changed next, and this was the part that would stay with every person who witnessed it for the rest of their lives, the detail they would reach for first when they tried to describe the moment to their families that evening, and find that words were inadequate containers for what they had seen. His eyes, which had been flat and distant, and carrying that particular matte quality that prolonged grief gives to children's eyes, suddenly filled with light. Not metaphorical light, actual, visible, physical light, the kind that happens when the muscles around the eyes engage fully, and the eyes themselves widen slightly, and everything that has been dimmed behind them suddenly has a clear path to the surface. Caleb Harmon's eyes came alive. And then the smile arrived. It was not a polite smile. It was not the careful, performative, going through the motions smile that adults had been gently coaxing out of Caleb for 3 months with candy and distraction, and the exhausting effort of trying to remind a grieving child that happiness still existed somewhere in the world. It was not a smile that had been negotiated or encouraged or produced on request. It was the real thing. Wide and unguarded and absolutely, overwhelmingly honest, the kind of smile that belongs exclusively to children who have not yet learned to keep their joy at a socially acceptable volume. It took over his entire face with the democratic thoroughness of something that had been building pressure behind a door for 3 months and had finally, in this moment, found the door open. It was the smile that Danielle Harmon had called her whole, entire universe. It was the smile that Linda had whispered prayers about in the dark. It was the smile that Dr. Alcott had told Linda, in careful professional language, would return when Caleb found something that made him feel safe enough to be himself again. It had returned. Right here, right now, on a courthouse bench in Charlotte, North Carolina, with a Belgian Malinois head on his knee and his stuffed rabbit forgotten on the floor beside his shoes. The court clerk, a 43-year-old woman named Beverly Marsh, who had processed legal documents in this building for 11 years, and had developed the focused tunnel vision of someone who had learned to move efficiently through human drama without being derailed by it, stopped mid-stride with a stack of folders in her arms and stared. The defense attorney near the window, a sharp, perpetually distracted man named Gerald Acaffer, who had not looked up from his phone voluntarily in approximately 2 hours, looked up from his phone. He did not look back down. 2 officers at the security checkpoint turned simultaneously toward the corner, drawn by something they couldn't name, some shift in the emotional atmosphere of the room that registered on their skin before it registered in their minds. A young paralegal sitting 3 seats away on a nearby bench looked over and then looked away and then looked back again, because the first look hadn't been enough to process what she was seeing. The whole room didn't stop. Courthouses don't stop. They are machines of procedure and momentum, and they do not pause for miracles, but something moved through it. A ripple, an atmospheric shift. The way a room feels different when a window is opened and outside air comes in, subtle but undeniable, and noticed by every person present, even if not a single one of them could have articulated exactly what had changed. What had changed was this: something genuinely beautiful had just happened in their presence. And human beings, regardless of how busy or preoccupied or professionally detached they are, cannot be in the presence of something genuinely beautiful without feeling it somewhere in their bodies. They felt it. Linda Harmon did not grip the doorframe this time, because there was no doorframe within reach. She simply sat on that courthouse bench beside her grandson and pressed both hands over her mouth and let the tears come. Not the careful, controlled, private tears she had been crying for 3 months in the shower and in the car, and in the dark after Caleb was asleep, but open tears, public tears, the kind that don't ask permission and don't apologize for themselves. She had not seen that smile since the night Danielle tucked Caleb in for the last time. She had carried the absence of it like a stone in her chest every single day. And now here it was, returned from wherever grief had taken it, delivered back to her by a police dog, who had felt something from across a crowded room that nobody else in the building had been capable of feeling. Rex opened one eye and looked up at Caleb's shining face. His tail moved slow, steady, certain 3 times. Then he closed his eye again and stayed exactly where he was. Because the work wasn't finished yet. But it had beautifully, unmistakably, irrevocably begun. There are certain kinds of healing that cannot be rushed. You cannot schedule them into a therapy appointment, or measure them on a clinical chart, or produce them through any amount of careful, loving, well-intentioned adult effort. They arrive on their own timeline, in their own way, through channels that nobody designed and nobody predicted, and nobody could have engineered even if they had tried. They require one specific ingredient that cannot be manufactured or substituted or approximated by anything else in the known world. They require the right presence. Not the right words, not the right technique, not the right environment or the right medication or the right therapeutic approach, though all of those things have their place and their value and their own quiet power. Just the right presence, warm and steady and completely without agenda, asking nothing, offering everything, content to simply exist alongside you in the middle of your pain without trying to fix it or rush it or redirect it toward a more comfortable destination. Rex was the right presence. He had always been the right presence for this moment, from the second he caught Caleb's scent across a crowded courthouse lobby. Everything that had happened since, the crossing of the marble floor, the gentle approach, the head on the knee, the smile that had stopped the room, had been leading here, to this wooden bench in this courthouse hallway, where a 45-minute conversation was about to take place between a 3-year-old boy and a Belgian Malinois that would quietly, permanently, rewrite the trajectory of one small life. Linda had gone to the clerk's window. She had not wanted to go. Every maternal and grandmotherly instinct she possessed had screamed at her to stay on that bench, to keep Caleb within arm's reach, to not leave him alone with a police officer and a working dog in the middle of a federal courthouse, no matter how extraordinary the preceding 5 minutes had been. But Dunley had read her hesitation with the perceptiveness of someone who spent his professional life reading people, and he had leaned toward her slightly and said, very quietly. "He's safe with us, ma'am. I promise you that. Take as much time as you need." And something in the steadiness of his voice, the particular steadiness of a person who means exactly what they say and has the track record to back it up, had convinced her. She stood up slowly. She looked at Caleb one more time. Caleb was looking at Rex. He didn't notice her leave. She took a breath that required considerable courage, turned toward the clerk's window, and walked away from her grandson for the first time since October without feeling like she was abandoning him. Because for the first time since October, he didn't look abandoned. He looked found. Dunley sat down on the bench beside Caleb, not too close, maintaining the careful spatial awareness of someone who understood that the dynamic here was between the boy and the dog, and his role was supporting cast at best. He rested his forearms on his knees, angled his body slightly away so as not to crowd the space, and settled in with the patient stillness of a man who had learned, through years of working alongside an animal of Rex's caliber, that the best thing a human could sometimes do was get very quiet and stay out of the way. Rex hadn't moved from his position. His head was still on Caleb's knee, his eyes half closed in the particular expression of a dog in a state of calm, alert contentment, present without being demanding, attentive without being intense. His breathing was slow and completely audible in the relative quiet of the hallway, and Dunley noticed that Caleb's breathing had unconsciously synchronized with it, matching Rex's rhythm with the natural, unthinking ease of a child who had found something genuinely soothing and was following it without knowing he was following it. That was when Caleb started to talk. It began with a single word. "Soft," Caleb said quietly, his fingers still moving through Rex's fur with the slow, exploratory attention of someone cataloging something precious. He wasn't talking to Dunley. He wasn't talking to the courthouse or the ceiling or the general atmosphere. He was talking to Rex in the direct and uncomplicated way that children talk to animals, without self-consciousness, without performance, without the filtering process that humans apply to conversations with other humans. Rex's ear twitched toward the sound of Caleb's voice. "Really soft," Caleb said, with slightly more conviction, as if Rex had questioned his assessment and he was standing by it. Dunley pressed his lips together to contain something that was halfway between a smile and something more complicated than a smile. Then Caleb said, "I have a truck." He paused, apparently considering whether this information required elaboration. "It's red," he continued. "It has 4 wheels, but one is missing, so it only has 3 wheels, but it still goes." Another pause. "Grandma says we'll get the wheel fixed, but we haven't yet." Rex's tail moved once. Caleb looked at the tail with obvious satisfaction, as if this constituted the ideal response to the information he had provided. And then, with the gradual, unstoppable momentum of a river that has found its course after a long time underground, Caleb Harmon began to talk in the way that he used to talk before October, freely, continuously, with the particular flowing logic of a 3-year-old mind that moves between topics through associations that are perfectly clear internally, even when they seem lateral to everyone else. He talked about the cartoon with the blue dog. It was his favorite, he explained to Rex, because the blue dog was funny and also because his mama used to laugh at the part where the blue dog did the dance, and she would cover her mouth when she laughed, which Caleb had always found mysterious and interesting. And one time she had laughed so hard she spilled her tea, and that had been the funniest thing Caleb had ever personally witnessed. He said the word mama, the way you say a word that you have been carefully keeping behind your teeth for a long time, and have finally, in the presence of the right listener, allowed out into the air. Dunley's jaw tightened. He looked at the far wall and breathed through his nose and maintained his composure through an act of will that he would later describe as one of the harder things he'd done in 12 years of police work. Rex's tail moved again, slow, rhythmic, patient. Caleb took this as encouragement, which it was. He talked about the blanket fort. It was still in the corner of the living room, he told Rex seriously. The chairs were still there, and the sheets were still draped over them, but nobody had gone inside it since Mama made it because it was Mama's fort, and it didn't feel right to go in it without her. But sometimes at night, when Grandma thought he was asleep, he would go and stand next to it and look at it, and he could almost feel like she was still in there. He said this last part without any particular drama, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who has not yet learned to dress grief up in euphemism. He said it the way you say something that is simply true. Dunley had to look at the ceiling. Rex lifted his head slightly from Caleb's knee and repositioned it with extraordinary deliberateness, so that it was resting at a slightly different angle, one that brought him fractionally closer to the boy. It was a movement of perhaps 2 inches. It lasted perhaps 1 second. It was, Dunley would tell his wife that evening while she listened with her hand over her mouth, one of the most intentional things he had ever seen a living creature do. Caleb put both hands on Rex's head and kept talking. He talked about the lavender soap. His mama had smelled like lavender soap in the mornings, he said, and sometimes Grandma's bathroom had a soap that smelled a little bit like it but not exactly, and when Caleb smelled the almost right soap, it made his chest feel funny in a way he didn't have a word for yet, but that he knew was important. He talked about the boots. There had been a puddle, a spectacular, enormous, irresistible puddle on the sidewalk outside their building, and he had jumped in it wearing his good boots before his mama could stop him, and the boots had been completely ruined, and he had expected to be in trouble, but instead his mama had looked at the boots and looked at him, and then looked at the puddle, and then jumped in the puddle herself in her own good shoes, and they had both been in trouble together, which had made it the greatest moment of Caleb's entire 3 years of life. He laughed when he told this story. It was a small laugh, careful, a little rusty from disuse, like a door being opened for the first time in a while, but it was completely real, completely his, and it filled that courthouse hallway with a sound so unexpectedly beautiful that Dunley felt it like a physical impact somewhere in the center of his chest. Rex's tail wagged 3 times in quick succession. Caleb grinned at him. When Linda Harmon returned from the clerk's window 45 minutes later, she stopped in the hallway doorway and took in the scene before her. Her grandson was leaning against Rex's warm flank with the comfortable ease of a child leaning against something that has always been there. He was mid-sentence, something involving a specific disagreement he had with a boy at his daycare about whether dogs or trucks were superior, a debate he appeared to be narrating to Rex with the expectation that Rex would weigh in on the correct side. Rex was listening with his ears forward and his eyes half open, and Dunley was sitting beside them with his forearms still on his knees, and an expression on his face that Linda had no adequate word for. The stuffed rabbit was still on the floor. Nobody had picked it up. Nobody had needed it. Linda stood in that doorway for a long moment without saying anything, memorizing every detail of what she was seeing. The angle of Caleb's head, the movement of Rex's tail, the quality of light coming through the courthouse windows and falling across her grandson's face, illuminating an expression she had not seen in 3 months and had been terrified she might never see again. He looked like himself. He looked, for the first time since the paramedics came and the world broke open, like the Caleb who had existed before all of it, curious and present and alive to the world around him, pouring himself into a conversation with the wholehearted commitment that had always been his defining characteristic. He looked like Danielle's son. Caleb looked up and saw her standing there. "Grandma," he said, with the bright authority of someone sharing important information, "his name is Rex and he likes when you scratch right behind this ear." He pointed to the spot behind Rex's left ear with absolute confidence. "I figured it out." Linda laughed. It came out broken and wet and completely undignified, and she didn't care even slightly. "Did you?" she managed. "Yes," said Caleb, with the satisfaction of a scientist confirming a hypothesis, and he turned back to Rex and scratched the ear in question as if to demonstrate. Rex closed his eyes and leaned into it. And in that courthouse hallway, on a Tuesday morning that had started like every other Tuesday morning, 45 minutes of conversation between a boy and a dog had quietly, completely, irrevocably rewrote everything. There are stories that belong to the people inside them. And then there are stories that belong to everyone. The difference is not always obvious from the outside. Both kinds of stories begin the same way, in ordinary places, between ordinary people, during moments that nobody initially recognizes as significant. Both kinds of stories involve real human hearts navigating real human pain. Both kinds of stories have details that are too specific and too true to have been invented by anyone. But somewhere in the telling, somewhere between the moment it happens and the moment it reaches the ears of the wider world, certain stories cross a threshold. They stop being about the particular people involved and start being about something universal, something that lives inside every person who hears them, waiting to be recognized. The story of Rex and Caleb crossed that threshold on a Wednesday morning, approximately 18 hours after it happened. And once it crossed, there was no bringing it back. Patricia Webb had worked courthouse security for 11 years. She was 54 years old, practical and no-nonsense by professional necessity, with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and the particular brand of calm efficiency that develops in people who spend their working lives managing the controlled chaos of a busy federal building. She had seen things in that courthouse that had surprised her. She had seen things that had disturbed her. She had seen moments of genuine human drama play out against the backdrop of marble floors and fluorescent lighting that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. But she had never seen anything like what she saw in that corner of the waiting area on Tuesday morning. She had been passing through the lobby on her way from the security office to the main checkpoint when she caught the scene from the corner of her eye, the boy, the dog, the officer, the grandmother at the clerk's window, and something made her stop. Not professional instinct, not security concern, something older and quieter than either of those things. The same something that makes you stop walking when you pass a window and see something beautiful happening on the other side of the glass. She stopped. She watched. And then, at the precise moment when Caleb's smile broke across his face like sunrise breaking over a hillside, wide and unstoppable and blazing with a joy that had no business existing in a federal courthouse on a Tuesday morning, Patricia Webb raised her phone with hands that were not entirely steady and took a photograph. She almost didn't. She was aware, in the way that thoughtful people are always aware, that some moments are too private for documentation, too sacred for a lens, that there is something extractive about photographing other people's vulnerable moments without their knowledge, something that doesn't sit entirely right even when the intention is good. She hesitated for a full 3 seconds, phone raised, thumb hovering over the button. And then she thought about the world outside those courthouse doors. She thought about how heavy it had been lately, how the news cycle ran on catastrophe, and the social media feeds ran on outrage, and the general atmosphere of public life had taken on a quality of relentless, exhausting darkness that made people feel like beauty was something that happened elsewhere, to other people, in circumstances that had nothing to do with their own lives. She thought, someone out there needs to see this today. She pressed the button. The photograph was extraordinary. Not because it was technically perfect. Patricia was a security officer, not a photographer, and the lighting in the courthouse waiting area was the flat, indifferent fluorescent lighting of institutional spaces everywhere. Not because it had been composed with any artistic intention. She had raised her phone quickly and instinctively, capturing what was in front of her without time for framing or consideration. It was extraordinary because of what it contained. In the center of the frame, Caleb's face, caught at the precise peak of that smile, the full, unguarded, take-no-prisoners smile that had stopped the room, with Rex's dark head resting on his knee and one small hand buried in thick fur. To the left, Officer Dunley, slightly out of focus, wearing an expression that told the complete story of a man watching something he had no adequate framework for. On the floor to the right, the forgotten stuffed rabbit lying on its side on the marble, abandoned by a child who had found something more comforting than a stuffed animal. And in the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, Linda Harmon at the clerk's window, turned slightly toward the scene, one hand pressed against her heart. Every important element of the story was in that single frame. It was, without anyone intending it to be, a perfect photograph. Patricia shared it internally first to the courthouse staff group chat with a caption that said simply, "This happened in our building this morning. Thought you all needed to see it." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 20 minutes, the group chat had erupted with reactions from clerks, officers, attorneys, and administrative staff who spent their days moving through the building with the focused purposefulness of people who had places to be and things to do. People who had been in that lobby that morning and hadn't noticed. People who had walked past that corner without looking. People who were now stopping at their desks and staring at their phones with expressions that their colleagues found surprising. Someone in the courthouse, Patricia never found out who, forwarded the photograph to a contact at a local Charlotte news station. By 6 p.m. Tuesday evening, the photograph was on the local news. By 10 p.m., it had been picked up by 2 additional regional outlets. By Wednesday morning, it had reached the national networks. The internet received it the way a parched field receives rain. Within 24 hours of the photograph appearing on national platforms, it had been shared 300,000 times. Within 48 hours, that number had passed 500,000. Comments arrived in volumes that crashed the servers of the local news station's website twice in a single afternoon. Not the comments that the internet usually produces, the sharp and divisive and performatively outraged commentary that had become the default register of online public discourse, but something entirely different. People were being kind to each other. In the comment sections, those notorious digital battlegrounds where civility goes to die, strangers were writing to other strangers with openness and vulnerability that took the moderators completely by surprise. Veterans were writing about their PTSD service dogs and what those animals had given them back when everything else had failed. Parents who had lost children were writing about grief and about the unexpected forms that comfort sometimes takes. Teachers and nurses and first responders and retirees and college students and grandparents were writing about their own dogs, gone or present, and what those animals had meant to them in their hardest moments. A woman in Montana wrote that she had been sitting in her car in a parking lot, crying, when she saw the photograph on her phone, and that it had made her go back inside. A man in Maine wrote that he had shown the photograph to his 7-year-old daughter who had recently lost her grandfather, and that his daughter had looked at it for a long time and then said, "Rex knew he was sad." A retired police officer in Texas wrote, "I worked with K-9 units for 22 years, and I want everyone to know, this is not surprising to anyone who has ever truly known one of these dogs. What is surprising is that the rest of the world is only finding out now." The post was shared in 37 countries. It was translated into 14 languages. A grief counseling organization in New York used it in a presentation about alternative healing approaches for children who had experienced traumatic loss. The Charlotte Police Department released an official statement on Wednesday afternoon. It was written with the careful, measured language of institutional communications, but even through the formal phrasing, something genuine came through. The statement honored Rex and Officer Dunley for demonstrating that service takes many forms, and that the impact of a K-9 unit could not always be measured in arrests or commendations or the traditional metrics of law enforcement success. It noted that Rex had received multiple commendations for his law enforcement work, and that this moment represented a different but equally important dimension of what it meant to serve a community. It ended with a line that was quoted in nearly every subsequent news story about the photograph. Sometimes the most important work happens in the spaces between the official duties, in the quiet moments where compassion reaches someone that procedure alone never could. Rex received a formal citizen commendation, the first ever awarded to a Charlotte K-9 for emotional service rather than law enforcement action. Officer Dunley received a commendation as well, though he deflected every interview request with characteristic modesty, saying consistently that he hadn't done anything except follow his partner's lead. Rex knew what he was doing, he told the one reporter he agreed to speak to briefly outside the precinct on Thursday morning. I just held the leash. But it was the unofficial title that stuck. Somewhere in the vast, churning, unpredictable organism of the internet, in the comment sections and the share captions and the Twitter threads and the Facebook posts that carried the photograph from screen to screen across the country and beyond, a name emerged organically, without anyone deciding on it or campaigning for it or coordinating its adoption. People started calling Rex the dog who knew. It appeared first in a comment that received 40,000 likes within 6 hours. Then it appeared in share captions. Then in news headlines. Then in the Charlotte Police Department's own social media posts, where it was used without quotation marks, as if it had always been his name. The dog who knew. 3 words that contained, in the compressed and efficient way that the best language always does, the entire story. The sensing from across the room, the crossing of the marble floor, the head on the knee, the smile, the 45 minutes, all of it compressed into 3 words that anyone who saw the photograph immediately understood without needing to be told. He had known. From 50 feet away, through courthouse noise and recycled air and the indifferent machinery of a Tuesday morning, Rex had known. And he had done something about it. Linda Harmon saw the photograph for the first time on Wednesday morning when a friend texted it to her with a message that said, "Is this Caleb?" She sat down on her kitchen floor. She didn't plan to sit on the floor. Her legs simply decided, without consulting the rest of her, that standing was no longer appropriate given the circumstances, and she went down slowly until she was sitting with her back against the kitchen cabinets, phone in both hands, staring at the image of her grandson's face. That smile, that magnificent and long-absent smile, preserved forever in a photograph that half the country had now seen. She sat there for a long time. Caleb came padding into the kitchen in his socks, saw her on the floor, and sat down beside her with the matter-of-fact companionship of a child who finds nothing unusual about sitting on the kitchen floor with his grandmother on a Wednesday morning. "What you looking at?" he asked. Linda turned the phone so he could see. Caleb looked at the photograph for a moment, then he pointed at Rex. "That's Rex," he said, with the satisfied confidence of someone identifying an old friend. "Yes, it is," Linda said. "Can we go see him?" Caleb asked. Linda put her arm around her grandson and pulled him close and pressed her lips to the top of his head and stayed there for a moment that belonged entirely to them. "Soon," she whispered. And this time, she already knew exactly how she was going to make that happen. There are certain kinds of endings that refuse to behave like endings. They arrive dressed in the clothing of conclusions, the loose threads gathered, the emotional arc completed, the story apparently told, but something in them keeps moving forward, keeps generating warmth and momentum and consequence long after the final page should have been turned. They are not really endings at all. They are beginnings that have been mistaken for endings by people who weren't paying close enough attention. They are seeds that look like last chapters until something green and insistent starts pushing up through the soil, and you realize that what you thought was a conclusion was actually an origin. What happened between Rex and Caleb in that Charlotte courthouse was not an ending. It was the most important beginning of Caleb Harmon's young life. And 3 weeks after that Tuesday morning, on a bright and unseasonably warm Friday afternoon in November, the next chapter of that beginning was about to be written on a wide-open training field on the outskirts of Charlotte, with a red toy truck missing one wheel and a Belgian Malinois who had been waiting, in his own patient and certain way, for this exact moment. Officer Marcus Dunley had made the call to Linda Harmon on a Thursday evening, sitting at his kitchen table after dinner with Rex asleep across his feet and a cup of coffee going cold beside his elbow. He had been thinking about it for days. He wasn't entirely sure it was protocol. He wasn't entirely sure there was a protocol for any of this, which was part of what made it both complicated and freeing. There was no guidebook for what Rex had done in that courthouse. There was no procedure manual chapter titled, "What to Do After Your K-9 Partner Identifies," and begins the emotional recovery of a grieving 3-year-old during routine courthouse duty. He was operating entirely on instinct and on the deep, bone-level certainty that the story was not finished and that he had a responsibility to make sure it continued. Linda answered on the second ring. She had been expecting his call, she told him, not because she had known he would call specifically, but because she had been hoping someone would, and sometimes hope has a way of manufacturing its own fulfillment. She said yes before he had finished explaining what he was proposing. She said yes the way you say yes to something you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting for it. They arranged the visit for the following Friday afternoon. Dunley hung up the phone and looked down at Rex, who had opened one amber eye during the conversation and was now watching his partner with the attentive calm of an animal who understands that something is being arranged on his behalf. "Friday," Dunley told him. Rex closed his eye. He already knew. Caleb was ready an hour before they needed to leave. He stood by the front door in his best shoes, navy blue sneakers with a Velcro strap that he had learned to fasten himself 3 weeks ago and was extremely proud of, with his red toy truck held in both hands and an expression of concentrated seriousness that Linda found so endearing she had to take 3 photographs before they left the apartment, because she understood instinctively that this was a day she would want to remember in detail for the rest of her life. "Do you think Rex will remember me?" Caleb asked in the car, with the vulnerability of someone asking a question whose answer matters enormously. Linda glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Baby," she said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had watched a police dog cross a courthouse lobby with complete intention and arrive at her grandson's knee as if guided by something older and truer than training. "Rex has been thinking about you since the minute you left that courthouse. I am 100% sure of that." Caleb considered this information. "Okay," he said, satisfied. He held the red truck in his lap the rest of the way there. The Charlotte K-9 training facility sat on 12 acres of open land on the eastern edge of the city, a sprawling compound of obstacle courses and tracking fields and agility runs and low buildings that smelled permanently of dog and effort, and the particular institutional cleanliness of spaces where serious work gets done seriously. It was not designed to be beautiful. It was designed to be functional. But on that Friday afternoon, with the November sun sitting low and golden over the open fields, and the air carrying the particular crispness of a southern autumn that has finally remembered its responsibilities, it looked, to Caleb Harmon, like the most magnificent place he had ever been in his entire 3 years of life. Rex was waiting at the gate. Not because Dunley had positioned him there for dramatic effect, though the effect was undeniably dramatic, but because Rex had been oriented toward the facility entrance for the past 20 minutes with the focused attention of a dog who has decided that the most important thing happening in his immediate world is the approach of a specific vehicle carrying a specific small person. When Linda's car pulled into the parking area and the door opened and Caleb climbed out with his navy sneakers and his red truck and his face already breaking into the smile that had become, over the past 3 weeks, a more frequent visitor to his features, Rex made a sound. It was not a bark. It was not a whine. It was something between the two, a low, resonant vocalization that Dunley, in 12 years of partnership, had never heard Rex produce before and would never hear him produce again. It was the sound of recognition, of reunion, of a creature who had been waiting for something to return and was now watching it arrive and was entirely unable to contain the fact of its own relief and joy. Caleb heard the sound and his whole face blazed. "Rex," he shouted, with the full volume, full-body commitment of a 3-year-old, expressing an emotion too large for indoor voices. And he ran across the parking area with the red truck bouncing in his hands and his best shoes slapping the asphalt, and every officer on the facility turning to watch. Rex pressed his nose through the gate. Caleb pressed his forehead against it from the other side. For a moment they were separated by a chain-link fence, and it didn't matter even slightly because they had found each other again, and that was the only fact either of them needed. Dunley opened the gate. And Rex, decorated, commended, professionally impeccable Rex, who maintained his composure in bomb scares and criminal pursuits and high-stress courthouse environments, without a single deviation from protocol. Rex forgot himself entirely for approximately 15 seconds, which was 15 seconds more than he had ever forgotten himself in 4 years of service. He jumped, not aggressively, joyfully, with his front paws briefly on Caleb's shoulders, and his tail moving so fast it was practically a blur, and his tongue finding every inch of Caleb's giggling face with the enthusiastic thoroughness of a dog making absolutely certain that the person in front of him is real and present and genuinely here. Caleb laughed. Not the careful, rusty, tentative laugh that had emerged for the first time in the courthouse hallway 3 weeks ago. A full laugh, deep and rolling and completely abandoned, the laugh of a child who has forgotten everything except the fact that right now, in this moment, life is extraordinarily and overwhelmingly good. Every officer on the field stopped what they were doing. Nobody spoke. They just watched. The afternoon unfolded with the particular golden perfection of days that you recognize, even while they are happening, as days you will carry with you forever. Dunley walked Caleb through the facility with Rex at their side, narrating everything with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that every detail mattered to the small person beside him. Caleb watched Rex navigate an obstacle course with wide eyes and a running commentary. He went over it. "Did you see, Grandma?" He went over it. That kept the assembled officers suppressing smiles behind their professional composure. He watched Rex demonstrate tracking drills, following a scent trail with the focused intensity of a creature operating at the absolute peak of its abilities. Caleb tracked Rex's progress across the field with the serious attention of a scientist observing a critical experiment, clutching his red truck, and occasionally providing encouragement in the form of whispered go Rex," that carried further than he intended and made Dunley's shoulders shake with suppressed laughter. He sat cross-legged in the November grass and ate a peanut butter sandwich that Linda had packed, with Rex stretched out beside him accepting pieces of crust with the dignified gratitude of a dog who is doing you a favor by accepting your offerings. Caleb told Rex about the 3 weeks since the courthouse, about how he had gone back to his toy trucks, about how he and Linda had finally gone inside the blanket fort together, and how it had been sad but also good in a way he didn't have a word for yet, about how he had told his daycare teacher about Rex, and she had made him stand up in front of the class and tell the whole story, and everyone had listened. Rex listened now the way he had listened then, completely, without interruption, with those amber eyes steady and warm and entirely present. The moment came at the end of the afternoon, when the sun had dropped lower, and the shadows of the fence posts stretched long across the training field, and Linda was standing at the edge of the grass with her phone raised, because she had learned her lesson about not documenting the moments that mattered. Dunley crouched down in front of Caleb. He unclipped Rex's leash from the training harness. He held the handle out toward the boy. "You want to walk him," he said. Caleb looked at the leash handle. He looked at Rex. He looked at Dunley. He looked back at the leash handle with the expression of someone being offered something so significant that their entire system needs a moment to process whether it is real. Then he reached out and took it. Both hands, wrapped around the handle with a grip that was simultaneously careful and firm, the grip of someone who understands the weight of what they are holding and intends to honor it completely. He looked up at Rex. Rex looked down at him. Something passed between them in that look that had no name in any language, but that every person watching understood immediately and completely. Caleb squared his shoulders. He began to walk. He walked Rex across that training field slowly and with extraordinary seriousness, his small shoulders back, his chin up, his navy sneakers moving through the November grass with the measured, deliberate stride of someone performing an important duty. The red truck was tucked under his left arm. The leash was held in both hands in front of him. Rex walked exactly at his pace, not pulling ahead, not lagging behind, perfectly matched to the speed of a 3-year-old boy who was taking the biggest walk of his young life. Every officer on the Charlotte K-9 training facility had stopped working. They stood at the edges of the field, hardened, experienced, professionally unsentimental people who had built careers around maintaining composure in difficult circumstances. And they watched in complete silence as a small boy in navy sneakers walked a decorated police dog across a grass field in the golden late afternoon light. Nobody spoke. One officer near the fence removed his cap. Nobody thought that was strange. Linda lowered her phone after a while because she realized she was missing the moment by trying to capture it, and some moments are more important to feel than to record. She watched her grandson walk that field and she let herself feel everything. The grief for Danielle that never fully left, the gratitude that still surprised her with its intensity, the profound and humbling wonder of watching a child choose, day by day and moment by moment, to come back to life. Child psychologists who later studied Caleb's case described what Rex had provided as a form of healing that operated below the threshold of language, reaching the parts of a grieving child's nervous system that words and therapy and adult love, for all their power, sometimes couldn't access. They wrote papers about it. They gave presentations. They used the photograph, Caleb's smile, Rex's head on his knee, the forgotten stuffed rabbit on the marble floor, as a case study in alternative pathways through childhood grief. But Linda didn't need a paper to explain it. She had watched it happen in real time, in a courthouse waiting area, on an ordinary Tuesday morning that had turned out to be the least ordinary morning of her life. She had watched a dog cross a room toward a broken-hearted little boy and choose him, simply, quietly, without hesitation, with the ancient and infallible certainty of a creature that felt things that humans had long since forgotten how to feel. And she had watched everything that had gone dark in her grandson's world begin its slow, stubborn, extraordinary return to light. In the weeks and months that followed, Caleb continued to improve in ways that consistently surprised and moved the people around him. He went back to his toy trucks. He started asking questions again, the endless, glorious, exhausting questions of a child who is genuinely curious about the world and has remembered that the world is worth being curious about. He began sleeping through the night. He started drawing again, enormous, colorful, chaotic drawings that covered entire sheets of paper and spilled off the edges, drawings of trucks and dogs, and a woman with dark hair who was always smiling. He drew Rex constantly. Rex running, Rex sitting, Rex with his head on a boy's knee. He drew them in crayon and marker, and once, memorably, in mud on the back porch, which Linda chose to photograph rather than scold because she understood that some art is more important than a clean porch. Every morning, without fail, he asked if today was the day they could go see Rex. Linda always said soon. She always meant it. Because Officer Dunley had called again, 2 weeks after the training facility visit, and proposed something that had never been done before in the Charlotte K-9 program. An informal, ongoing visiting arrangement. Monthly, if Linda was agreeable. Just Caleb and Rex and a field and as much time as the boy needed. Linda had said yes before he finished the sentence. Some things in this world cannot be fully explained. Some healings arrive through channels that science is still decades away from mapping, through frequencies that our instruments are not yet sensitive enough to detect, through forms of intelligence and compassion that exist in creatures we have spent centuries underestimating, because they cannot tell us in words what they know. Rex knew something that Tuesday morning that nobody else in that courthouse knew. He knew it from 50 feet away, through recycled air and institutional noise, and the accumulated human presence of hundreds of strangers who had nothing to do with what he was about to do. He knew that there was a child in the corner of that room who needed him. And he went. Without hesitation, without protocol, without a single moment of doubt or uncertainty or waiting for permission from a world that hadn't yet caught up to what he already understood. He simply went. And everything that followed, the smile, the hallway, the photograph, the 500,000 shares, the training field, the monthly visits, the drawings in crayon and marker and mud, the questions returning, the laughter returning, the light returning, everything that followed was the consequence of that one ancient, instinctive, completely certain decision. A dog crossed a room. A boy smiled. And the world, which had been very dark for a very long time in one small corner of one apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina, began slowly and stubbornly and beautifully to come back to life. Some things only need to be felt. Rex knew that. He always did. He always will.